Good evening. Welcome to the Big Story. I'm Regina Lay.
I'm Pauline Verzosa.
And I'm Shawn Yao.
Tonight's big stories: the United States exempts military assistance to the Philippines from its global foreign aid freeze, green-lighting over $300 million in aid to modernize the AFP.
After former President Rodrigo Duterte accused his successor of being a dictator in the making, Malacanang claps back and calls Digong a rumor monger and a one-man fake news factory.
And 2 weeks after announcing its private equity firm, Maharlika Investment Corporation makes its third investment, this time in the Makilala Mining Company, the local subsidiary of Australia-listed Celsius Resources.
Kicking off on a good note, the Trump administration has released $5.3 billion in provisions it exempted from the foreign aid freeze, the global foreign aid freeze, I should say, and the AFP modernization program is among those spared. It was Reuters who first reported on the exemptions, which was verified by Philippine Ambassador to the United States, Jose Manuel Babe Romualdez. In all, 243 programs were given the green light by the Trump administration, majority of which are related to security and counter-narcotics. The lion's share of the U.S. aid goes to initiatives pushed by the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs that oversees arms sales and military assistance to other countries and organizations. Also getting the green light for funding are programs by the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs meant to help fight drug trafficking. That same agency gets financial boost as well when crafting databases to track migrants, identifying possible terrorists, and sharing of biometric information.
Now, as for the amount approved for the Philippines, $336 million for the modernization of the armed forces, which is just a portion of what was committed under former President Joe Biden. Other waivers include $870 million for Taiwan. Now, Ukraine got a much smaller pot at just $21.5 million, though it's not clear if there's other funding freed up elsewhere. In a statement, Foreign Affairs spokesperson Maria Teresita Daza says both countries, meaning the Philippines and the U.S., are committed to the treaty alliance and to efforts to further strengthen our defense cooperation and interoperability. Daza ended with, "We will continue to engage the U.S. government on the importance of our bilateral work in supporting our shared goals and priorities."
Meanwhile, humanitarian programs received very limited aid. The biggest by far is the $500 million funding for the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR for short, which mainly funds healthcare services in Africa. That pales in comparison to the previous annual budget of $6.5 billion. Meanwhile, U.S. aid got only less than $100 million compared to its $40 billion annual funding before the freeze. It included $78 million in non-food assistance for Gaza, while a separate $56 million have been allocated for the International Committee of the Red Cross, also in connection with aid as the Israel-Hamas ceasefire holds. Elon Musk and other Trump aides have laid off more than 10,000 workers and dismantled programs throughout the U.S. government, from the Department of Education to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, according to Reuters. The Pentagon is now working to cull employees as well, with tens of thousands in the line of fire.
Now, bottom line, it is simply not in the public interest to retain individuals whose contributions are not mission critical.
In other news, Philippine Defense Secretary Gilbert Gibo Teodoro welcomed Japan's Defense Minister Gen Nakatani to Manila today, with both sides committing to maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region.
We share also the common cause of resisting any unilateral attempt to reshape the global order without the consent of the participants of this global order and the attempt to reshape international law by force.
The security environment surrounding us is becoming increasingly severe, and that it is necessary for the two countries as strategic partners to further enhance defense cooperation and collaboration in order to maintain peace and stability in Indo-Pacific amid such a situation.
Tokyo sees 3 areas that it can work with Manila on to boost defense cooperation. First is operational cooperation, which includes high-level meetings and information sharing. Second, an educational exchange for the military that covers Filipino soldiers training in their National Defense Academy. And third is military cooperation through the modernization of defense equipment and technology. For his part, Teodoro says he hopes Japan will finally ratify its Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or Free Trade Agreement with the Philippines.
Later today, Nakatani also paid a courtesy call on President Bongbong Marcos at Malacanang. Marcos said he hopes the visit will further strengthen the defense cooperation between Manila and Tokyo. The Japanese defense minister responded by saying that the two countries have been making great developments in the areas of defense and security cooperation under the current administration. On Sunday, Nakatani also took time to visit Wallace Air Station in San Fernando, La Union. This military base serves as home to a radar surveillance facility which Japan has loaned to the Philippines. The Japanese defense minister was pleased with how the radar helped in promoting maritime domain awareness in the South China Sea.
I was able to actually feel the great role that the Philippines plays in this region, including the South China Sea. In particular, I was very encouraged by my close observation that Japanese air surveillance radar systems are making an extremely large contribution to the air defense of the Philippines and peace and stability in the South China Sea.
From a looming dictatorship to selling off the country's gold reserves, the word war between former President Rodrigo Duterte and President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. continues to escalate. Maricel Halili with that story.
Mr. Marcos is veering towards a dictatorship.
That was former President Rodrigo Duterte's latest tirade against his successor and one soft ally, President Bongbong Marcos. Digong believes that the chief executive will not step down after his term and declare martial law, just like what his father did to hold on to power. Duterte said this during an indignation rally in Mandaue City, Cebu on Saturday. By Monday, it was the turn of Malacanang freshly appointed press officer to strike back. For Undersecretary Claire Castro, Duterte is just rumor mongering.
Anong ebidensya? Paano mapapatunayan? Katulad na sinabi ko, hindi tayo pwedeng maniwala sa mga pang-iintriga lamang na walang ebidensya. At ito naman, siguro naman ay natatandaan ninyo, nung panahon ni dating Pangulong Duterte, inamin niya, fiscal pa lang siya. Expert na siya sa pag-intriga at pagplanta ng ebidensya.
Castro also turned the tables on Duterte and accused the former president of being bent on regaining position and power in government.
So alam na natin kung saan ang punta nila. Gusto nila ulit makuha ang power, ang authority, ang posisyon.
Castro also had this to say about Duterte's claim that there was no transparency on the sale of the country's gold reserves, which led to the peso's decline.
Hindi pa to campaign joke ulit ni dating Pangulong Duterte? Hindi ba tayo nasanay dun sa jet ski promise niya? Na nung naniwala tayo halos sa mga sumuporta sa kanya, tinawag tayong stupid. So pag naniwala ba tayo ulit sa sinasabi niyang ito, baka mapagkamalan niya tayo ulit at tawagin tayong stupid.
Executive Secretary Lucas Bersamin had earlier dismissed the latest tirades of Duterte as baseless and ridiculous statements, a tall tale from a tyrant who did not respect the rights of the people. Bersamin added that Duterte's claim was just another budol or deception emerging from a one-man fake news factory. For News 5, Maricel Halili, We Are One News.
Just weeks after it made its maiden investment in the National Grid Corporation of the Philippines, Maharlika is back at the table. This time, it has signed a binding term sheet for a $76.4 million bridge loan to Makilala Mining Company, which is the Philippine affiliate of Australia-listed Celsius Resources. Makilala operates the Maalinaw, Kaigutan, Biog Copper Gold Project, or MCB project for short, in the Cordillera Administrative Region. That project was granted a 6-month extension by the DENR last year to provide proof of financial capabilities. So this funding from Maharlika Sovereign Wealth Fund will go towards a feasibility study, front-end engineering design, and early development work. This comes just 2 weeks after President and CEO Rafael Consing announced that the fund was teaming up with Thai conglomerate Charo and Pokpan to raise up to $1 billion for a private equity fund. Shares of Celsius Resources in Australia jumped on the news. As of 6 p.m. Manila time, the penny stock was up more than 36%, and Celsius Executive Chairman Julito Sarmiento said the investment reflects the Philippine government's commitment to critical metals and responsible mining.
Now, shifting gears, DPWH Secretary Manuel Bonoan says the EDSA rehabilitation project will likely begin in the second half of March. He said this during an interview with our sister program, Ted Filon and DJ Chacha.
Nung una po kasi inanunsyo ng MMDA na target pong simulan Marso ngayong taon, ito pong EDSA rehabilitation. Nagkaroon po ba ng pagbabago sa magiging schedule? Nagkaroon po ba tayo ng changes sa timeline or it will still start on March?
But sometime in March actually yung namin, umpisa na namin para we take advantage of the good construction weather para mas mapabilis po yung paggawa namin ngayon.
Oo. Sekman,
I think within the second half of March siguro, I think, I estimate ko yun. Originally, it was supposed to be in the outer lane, yung may mga drainage. Pero kasi maraming dito, mga facilities. So, as we are doing yung inventory ng facilities and how to design yung drainage system dyan, so unahin na muna namin yung walang problema like yung sa bus, yung inner lane which is actually the bus lane na. Except sa stations nila.
Bonoan says they will work on the exact timetable in the next few days and try to finalize it soon. One of the big challenges would be constructing a drainage system along the whole stretch of EDSA, which spans more than 23 kilometers. In the past, road projects also encountered delays due to existing utility lines. Bonoan says they've decided to prioritize a southbound lane first instead of northbound as previously announced, as this has more alternate lanes for motorists. He also says they will try to engage several construction firms at the same time with work carrying on for 24 hours straight.
Southbound muna. And ito nga yung ini-schedule namin kung saan yung mas madali ng konti na gagawin, yung may mga liba yung pwede gumamit ng alternate routes muna. And then yung mga medyo difficult sections na wala talang alternate route, yun ang ihuhuli namin siguro, Ted. Yung mga ganun yung arrangements na ginagawa namin. I think 24 hours and there will be titingnan namin kung we can employ or we can actually engage several construction segments actually all at the same time. Yung hindi masyadong nakakaabala ng traffic para mas mabilis.
Opo. So,
kasi meron din kaming timetable na hinahabol kasi because of the ASEAN meeting dito sa Philippines in 2026.
The big question is whether they were going to make it in time for that. We don't have specific dates yet for the ASEAN. And yes, the Philippines is hosting it in 2026, but, and if I understood Secretary Bonoan correctly, he said it will take 1 year approximately just for southbound alone. And the reason they're focusing on southbound first is because mas may alternate routes compared to the northbound lane. So I don't know if that means they're gonna do it simultaneously because both lanes have to be repaired, right?
Or else walang kwenta, di ba? I remember also the last time we talked to Sec Bonoan, we had to like kind of eke it out of him that it was actually the working deadline was actually for ASEAN 2026.
Yes,
at that
correct.
time, we had just gotten the hosting announcement because it wasn't supposed to
correct.
be.
At that time, we were talking about the major flooding issue because it was at the height of the back-to-back typhoons, and yun nga, we saw how EDSA turned into a river.
And true enough, as he was saying, and that soundbite that we heard, mahihirapan yung drainage
Yep.
Diba? And that's part of it, the drainage.
So
along 23 kilometers.
Well, we'll see if 24 hours of continuous work will be effective for them, even with this timeline.
Let's put it this way, if they're able to do it at that speed, then we'll always hold them to kaya nyo pala eh.
I don't know. I mean, what's the DPWH track record?
Should we just leave it there?
No, we did try to get Secretary Manny Bunoan, by the way, for more
details.
More details on this, for clarification. We haven't gotten him so far, but we will. But the point is that this major undertaking is expected to start mid to late March. It's already March at the end of this week. Why do we not have a timeline yet?
Can I add
because
to that?
It's affecting thousands and thousands of commuters every single day.
On top of that, there was talk last year that we have to repair for seismic considerations. The
Yes.
Guadalupe Bridge, which is
Yes,
supposed
correct.
to be by
Yes.
October. So I don't know how these will all tie in together.
We talked to him about it, if I recall
Yes, we
correctly,
did,
as
we
well,
did.
on Guadalupe, pero we didn't get a specific timeline on it.
I think he didn't want to make promises like in advance.
And also the question of whether you can do all these projects simultaneously, because one of the other issues that he highlighted as to why it's going to take so long is because there are other simultaneous drainage system works along EDSA. So I don't know if that means the smaller projects are going to have to stop for them to carry out this massive EDSA rehab project, or it's going to continue simultaneously. And again, the bottom line for us is, what does that mean in terms of the traffic? It's already bad enough as it is, right?
The other thing I did kind of note from our last conversation with Sec Manny was that this repair is sort of kind of like getting plastic surgery. It's kind of an aesthetic thing, or the top, right? The major consideration, I think it was mandated by the president. He said it's really matagtag and it's really hard to text. That was the peg. The peg was, ang hirap di ka makatext sa cellphone dahil like that.
Well, to be fair, may official name siya. It's called the CTMP, Comprehensive Traffic Management Plan. So that's the official name for it. And yes, the Marcos administration had made improving quality, the riding quality of EDSA a priority project, which I think some people may not know about. And you know, even in the Duterte time, how could we forget I will solve traffic in 6 months. That campaign, that actually that wasn't a campaign promise. He was already president then when he said that. How could anyone forget it, right? So every politician, every official knows how crucial it is to solve the EDSA traffic problem. The question is, the question that I'm raising right now is, do we have the capability to do this?
The capability or the political will to do this?
Well, both. And also, because there's a technical question. For instance, as Pawi had raised, can they do 24-hour construction, for instance? Do we have the money to hire simultaneous contractors to carry out roadwork simultaneously at various stretches? If you're going to close down a segment, okay, then get work done, get work running 24 hours so that we could finish as soon as possible. There's a technical question, there's a financial question, there's a political will question.
There are so many questions.
No one is questioning at this point that EDSA needs to be rehabilitated. I'm asking what the impact will be on the motorists, because again, if this is meant to start mid to late March, why do we not have a timeline for it at this point in time? It's already end of February. It's already March 1 by the Saturday.
The target, at least, is not going to move. It's going to be, well, the dates have yet to be finalized, as you said, but you know, it's going to be ASEAN 2026. So that's going to be more or less at around the same time, right? In 2026, there's sort of a rough schedule. So I don't know if we'll make it. It's just about a year. But again, I do feel like...
So in the meantime, we don't use EDSA, or you don't use southbound line? I don't know. What does it mean, right?
We need clarity on that.
Exactly. And you're right. There's a lot of alternate routes that they would need to identify for all of the...
Do we already have the Mabuhay lanes and... you know, the placards are already there.
Okay, well, what will happen to the bus lanes then? And by the way, also, initially they said they were going to start with the inner lanes, tas naging outer lanes. Because outer lanes will be easier to fix daw muna.
Kasi hindi magagalaw yung bus lane.
Correct. Okay, so I don't know what the impact to that is. Does that mean they open up the best bus lanes to everyone in the meantime whilst road work is going on? I don't know.
suppose that's
I
one
have a
of
lot
the
of
things you have to put on your
as someone who
question list.
uses EDSA every
Every
single
day.
day, I have a lot of questions. I'm sorry, but we'll try to put that to DPWH Secretary Manny Bonon. Also, by the way, this is a joint project between DPWH, MMDA, and DOTR, newly installed Secretary.
But it will
DOTR
also-
Secretary Vince Dizon, if you are watching us, please. we
It will
need some
also involve all the
answers.
LGUs that EDSA passes through, and
Correct.
that's kind of almost all the Metro Manila LGUs.
Correct.
But as if we don't have enough bad news for Metro Manila motorists, I'm so sorry in advance because tomorrow there will be another fuel price hike. Oil firms have announced upward adjustments of 70 centavos a liter for gasoline, while diesel prices will be going up by 40 centavos a liter. For kerosene, the increase is at 20 centavos per liter. These adjustments are more or less across the board, with all the biggest companies, Caltex, Petron, Shell, and Sea Oil, implementing the same tomorrow, February 25 at 6 a.m. Clean fuel will be hiking prices a little later on in the day at 4:01 p.m. This is the second straight week of oil price hikes, with the Department of Energy citing the ongoing war between Russia and the Ukraine as a factor.
Lots to look forward to as a motorist, huh?
Exciting times.
But as a Metro Manila motorist.
Vince Dizon, though, was right. The solution to all of this is mass transport.
Well, that's like a 10-year solution.
Maybe more.
That's 10, 15-year solution, right? And already, yes, we know the subway work is underway. Pero yun nga, in the meantime, what do we do? I don't know. He's got his work cut out for him.
In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break first. But coming up is another question of whether or not Vice President Sara Duterte's impeachment trial can proceed while the Senate is in recess. UP College of Law senior lecturer attorney Paulo Tamase shares his insights when the big story returns. Keep it here on One News. Welcome back. You're watching the big story here on One News. Now, as I said earlier, there's a question of will the Senate President become Vice President if the VP gets impeached? Well, the answer is yes, but not automatically. Under the succession of government, the Senate President is third in line to the presidency. But under the Constitution, a vacancy in the office of the Vice President is settled by the President, who can appoint any member of Congress as Vice President. This is, however, subject to the approval of the members of the Senate and the lower house voting separately. In an interview with the Philippine Star's online show Truth on the Line, Senate President Cheese Escudero said he is not interested in the position. Escudero went on to say that delicadeza dictates that senator judges in the upcoming impeachment trial reject the offer to become vice president. Escudero also reiterated that he would not give in to pressure to either delay nor fast-track the impeachment proceedings.
If you ask me, I'm not interested, and it would be not good to look at. Kung magpapasa kami laban halimbawa sa kanya at tapos isa sa amin ang papalit, siguro it would be more prudent for those who voted to if at all remove the vice president to decline any such offer or nomination.
All right, here to discuss more about the impeachment and the mechanics of it, of Vice President Sara Duterte, is we have attorney Paulo Tamase. He is an assistant professor at the UP College of Law, where he specializes in constitutional law, among others. He is also the author, the primary author of the primer on impeachment. Good evening, welcome to the Big Story studio.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for coming to our assistance tonight.
Yes. Well, no, but maybe you should answer that question first on the Vice President, the story that Paui just read. It's not automatic that the Senate President or even the House President or House Speaker becomes Vice President should the Vice President get removed from office, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely not. So we don't have an acting Vice President in our system. And what the Constitution provides is if there's a vacancy in the vice presidency, the president gets to appoint from the Senate and the House. And I just want to point out that I think Senator Escudero said something about delicadeza in the process. The only time that from my recollection, we've had the vice presidential succession was during Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo's succession to the presidency. And the vice presidency was in fact filled up by a senator who did participate in the impeachment trial of ERAP, and that was Senator Gingona.
He was also the minority leader, I believe, at
But
that
he
time.
wasn't Senate President at that time, you're right.
Yeah, he wasn't.
He
So,
was the minority. He was in the minority at that time.
so the succession of the Senate president only really happens if both the presidency and the vice presidency are vacant. So if only one of them is vacant, then the Senate president doesn't actually succeed to that position. And it's a very temporary stopgap measure until a next president can be elected by the people at large. So the Constitution makes contingencies for that situation.
But in this case, he can only choose from the Senate President and the House Speaker?
No, the president can choose from anyone in the Senate or the House.
Okay.
And that choice has to be ratified, confirmed by separate votes in the House and the Senate.
Okay,
This
all
is when
along
we
I
talk
thought
about,
it was just the two houses, the two heads of Congress. I thought it was just the two heads of
It
Congress.
was anybody.
Anyone.
Yeah,
Okay.
anyone.
Anyone from Congress, it has to be ratified by both, by majorities in both houses, voting separately. Remember when voting separately became an issue
Yes.
as well. So it's very important to note that.
Yes.
Would that change things though?
Probably not. Honestly, the decision of the president who to choose as senator or as a vice president in case there will be a vacancy is really a political decision on his part. And typically, at least in the time that it was filled up by Senator Gingona, there seems to have been a support from both the House and the Senate. So there seems to be a lot of deference to the president's decision on who to select as his vice president in this situation.
In this case, from what you can see, he should have a lot of leeway too, right? It's not like people are jockeying to become vice president, right?
Yes, generally. So based on experience, there seems to be, people coalesce around the decision or the choice of the president.
Right. Okay, so we invited you here because you guys hosted a very interesting 3-hour forum last week at the UP campus talking about the impeachment and how it may be carried out. And I'd like to begin by tackling this very same questions that you raised. So if I could just, maybe you could flash the question on the big screen behind us so that everyone can see. So the first question is, can the 19th Congress call a special session and start a trial while in recess? There's been much debate over this. If we could just flash the graphic on the big screen behind us, not full screen, so that we could discuss it whilst the question is up there. But there's been a lot of debate over it, right?
Right.
We've heard from both sides. Where do you and what do you guys think? And in UP College of Law is of course the birthplace of a lot of the smartest, largest legal minds in the country.
Wait, but before you answer, Attorney, can we break it down into two parts? Because this question is actually two
you
questions.
Carry over.
Yeah.
So it is
cross
about
over
the
pala.
special session.
Yeah.
I mean, that is also being debated. Can they call a special session for impeachment or not, right? And can they start a trial while in recess, not just pre-trial?
All right. So whether the 19th Congress can call a special session, so there were two sides to this position. I think, on the whole, whether the Congress can be called to a special session by the president. The entire panel that we had, Senator Gilon, Justice Carpio Morales, Commissioner Sarmiento, Professor De Vera, and Professor Ted, they all agreed that the president could call, even if it's not for a legislative purpose.
Oh, okay.
But whether Congress can itself call itself into session, that one isn't really settled. Typically, the Constitution provides that the Senate and the House meet in an agreed schedule for both chambers, and it's the president who calls a special session. But on the second question of whether the Senate can start a trial while it is in a legislative recess, the panel was split there. So you had Commissioner Sarmiento, who is a member of the framers of the 1987 Constitution. He was part of the Constitutional Commission. His view is that, forthwith proceed, which we've talked about in the last time I was here, commands the Senate to meet, even in a recess. The rest of the panel wasn't too hot on that interpretation. I think their point is that forthwith proceed just means start the trial as soon as possible, but that it accounts for special circumstances, such as in this case a recess. And so for them, the Senate has to decide or has to come to trial immediately as soon as the Senate convenes again, but it does not have to do it during recess. So the panel was quite split on that. As for myself, I'm a bit, really in the middle on this. I haven't really formed a position yet. I tend to lean a little bit on Commissioner Sarmiento's side, that forthwith proceed means something in the constitutional text. But I'm also aware of the realities of how difficult it is for the Senate to meet legally while they're still in recess.
But wait, sorry, on the first part, they can call a special session even if it's not a legislative matter. That's in the Constitution?
In the Constitution, it says that the President may call for a special session at any time. And
It doesn't have to be legislative.
Yeah, it doesn't limit.
Qualify.
It doesn't qualify.
About what?
About the reason for it. And Senate President Drilon pointed it out in the forum. Separately, outside of the forum, I think Congressman Colmenares pointed out that the President has in the past called both houses in a special session to hear a foreign leader speak, the Japanese Prime Minister. And so it doesn't have to be for a legislative purpose. But whether Congress can itself call its own special session without the President, that one I think is, not
I wanted
really
to focus
settled.
on that one, Attorney, because as we know, congressional sessions are dictated by the Constitution, right? It basically dictates when you start, when the breaks are, how all of that. So if they convene themselves formally, then they would actually be violating the Constitution, right? Or is that not a black and white thing as well?
Not necessarily. So the Constitution mandates when they have to start and when they have to end. But the breaks in between are purely the practice of the House and the Senate. And in this case, they've decided on this calendar at the beginning of the 19th, I think the beginning of the session last year. So the intermittent breaks are really the call of the House and the Senate deciding together, but the mandatory start and the mandatory end, that's in the Constitution. And we're currently in one of those intermittent breaks.
We're in recess,
Yes,
right?
we're in the middle recess.
Okay, so the jury's still out on that one.
Yeah, definitely.
But also, Prof, I mean, you've got Senate President Cheese Escudero arguing that they are in recess, and that is his argument on why they cannot convene right now as an impeachment court. So at the end of the day, who will decide with finality on what forthwith means, on when exactly they should convene? I mean, what is the jurisdiction also of the Supreme Court there?
I think if you go to the views during the forum, all of us, so I myself, was in agreement that it's the Senate who gets to decide. And the reason why there's a lot of uncertainty around these questions is because the Senate hasn't made a formal official position yet. So Senator Escudero's views is one thing. As the Senate President, he certainly has weight, but the Senate hasn't decided yet on these questions. And the way that the Senate would decide would also trigger the independent judgment of the other branches of government as to whether they will respect the Senate's interpretation of the Constitution or they would have their own. And therefore, really, it's the Senate's first call, and probably the most important verdict might be the Senate.
That seems to be like my main takeaway after watching the live stream of the UP College of Law Forum. My takeaway was that, I mean, people are right. The ball really is in the Senate's court, and so much of the calls have to be made by the Senate. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a very fair assessment. Although that said, the fact that the ball is with the Senate not right now doesn't mean that people should not be engaging in an intelligent discussion of how to interpret the Constitution. So I think another point I've made before is that the Constitution is the people's document. We get as much a say about this as lawyers do, as senators do, as Supreme Court justices do. And therefore, the forum was really an opportunity to bring out all of these views on these novel questions and let the Senate eventually decide, but hopefully in an informed manner, knowing all of the pros and cons of each argument for what they're about to do.
Actually, I was telling my co-anchors about it. I was telling them about the closing speech of Attorney John Molo, whom you know very well. He said something along the lines of, yes, it is the Senate who will vote, but ultimately it is the people who will decide, who will judge.
Yes.
And which, speaks to your point now. The Senate is very sensitive to what the people are saying.
Definitely. You see that in the Estrada impeachment. So that first impeachment trial in our country's history, you get to see how the Senate was weighing evidence, was looking at the law, ultimately it got decided by people on the streets. And, you know, that doesn't have to be the way that every impeachment trial ends, but whether the impeachment court got it right or got it wrong is ultimately tested by people through the ballot, through public participation.
It was also kind of the same with the impeachment of Chief Justice Corona, right? In the beginning, they always say this, in the beginning, only a few senators were in favor. But in the end, there was, of course, a lot of public pressure. And we do know that those that are sitting in Senate right now, they more or less probably are looking at the executive. For a spot at the executive. And having said that, though, how much jurisdiction does the Supreme Court have? Everyone's looking to the Supreme Court to referee, to kind of give some sort of a final word on this. But
we'll save the Supreme Court question for last.
later.
Let's get through the second question.
Okay.
So, now, in the event the impeached resigns before conviction, does the trial get terminated, and will the consequences, or should the consequences apply? That's the second question in your forum. Tell us your takeaways from that.
I'm surprised that in the forum, I think everyone answered that the trial doesn't necessarily have to end. The ball is with the Senate now, and therefore, and Senate President Drilon pointed this out, because the Constitution says that the Senate is the sole judge of impeachment, of trials in impeachment, then it's the Senate who gets to decide when it will end trial. And that follows American precedent. We've talked about it before. And I think I was surprised that everyone on the panel agreed with it, that the Vice President's resignation doesn't necessarily result in the termination of the impeachment trial.
But back here in the Philippines, and the few impeachment trials we've seen, Senate has never chosen to continue with the trial after resignation of the impeachee.
Yes. So I did ask that question to Senate President Drilon. He was a great resource because he's the only person who's really been on both impeachment trials who we could get at that time.
He sat through two.
Yeah, both the Estrada and the Corona trials. And I did ask him, like, why did you decide to terminate the Estrada impeachment then? And his view was that it was a political decision to get the country to heal and come together. And that, again, highlights the political character of impeachment. If the Senate is the sole judge of impeachment contests, then the Senate gets to decide whether it will still continue or not. On the other hand, if you look at all of the other cases where there were impeachment complaints filed but did not proceed to trial at all, Ombudsman Gutierrez, Chairman Andy Bautista, I'm not sure if the complaint was even transmitted to the Senate at that time. But definitely the Senate didn't find it was consequential to continue with trial. And so again, going back to the initial point, there's a lot of respect that's given to the Senate when it comes to this question on deciding whether to push through or not with the trial.
But whether they decide either way, the consequences will apply? There are two penalties, right? There are two consequences. One is removal from office. Number two is permanent disqualification. As we know, people are more interested in the second one, whether that second consequences will apply.
Yes.
Should she get impeached?
So
convicted, I mean.
The view of the panel is actually informed by that second consequence. Everyone in the panel mentioned that there were two consequences in impeachment, and therefore there's a reason for the Senate to continue, even if the official resigns. And in this case, if Vice President Duterte resigns, the panel during the forum thought that it gets to decide whether she's fit to hold any public office, even after the vice presidency.
But the bottom line is the Senate gets to decide.
Again, the Senate gets to decide.
Okay, so much power. You would think that there's something in the Constitution that says if the person resigns, then you must carry on with the trial to see it through to the end, and then, decide from there. You would think there'd be something in the Constitution, but...
Well, the Constitution, as worded, we have a pretty long Constitution compared to, let's say, the United States. Yes. But it's still a very bare bones document. And it's designed really to adjust to the political and policy realities of the day. And so this was just one of those questions that the Constitution left for Congress, for the Senate, for the House, for us to decide at a particular point.
But it was so important, one important thing, we have been talking about the word forthwith, and apparently it only appears in our Constitution, not in the U.S. Constitution, which our Constitution was patterned off. So I was
who put that in? Who put in that word?
Maybe Commissioner Sarmiento had some input.
He talked about it, and I think the feedback was that, from Commissioner Sarmiento, was that there really was an intent on the part of the Constitutional Commission, the framers, to ensure that there would be no undue delay in the trial and in impeachment proceedings. you have to go back to the history of the Marcos era impeachment, where in the first Marcos administration, where there were so many procedural hurdles that Marcos allies were able to use to defeat impeachment complaints during martial law, immediately after martial law. So the framers thought of lowering the required number of votes to convict, lowering the required number of votes to impeach, and probably included forthwith as well in order to tell Congress to speed up the proceeding.
When it comes to forthwith, going back to, I think we touched on this earlier, some say there's an amount of reasonableness that goes with the as soon as possible message of the word forthwith, right? Meaning the reasonable means the schedule, the predetermined recesses, etc., etc. Because we are divided, people, right, are divided about that. How do you think it's going to fall, honestly? Because it's now up to the Senate gauging, right, Filipinos' reactions, our feelings, and which side we're on, and what we are inclined to pick if we were the senators. I think that's kind of their mindset, and trying to read our minds. Your thoughts?
I think that, in terms of interpreting forthwith, the Senate would be motivated by reasons outside of the law. And that's not unconstitutional or wrong at all. Right? Again, the Constitution gives them a lot of leeway to decide to interpret these provisions. I think on the whole, accountability requires that they move quickly. But there's also a recognition that this is a political process. And therefore, and it's conceded by the speakers of the second panel that we had, who are the counsels for the House and and Vice President Duterte, that the people get a say in this proceeding. Yeah. So insofar as the Senate is biding its time to gauge public opinion, that might be a valid reason, in my opinion, but there's a limit to that. Because you can never really know public opinion short of an election. And because the Vice President is not up for election, then any result from the upcoming elections would be speculation as to whether it's really driven by support of the Vice President or something else, or the sheer popularity of the candidates.
Yeah, well, Professor, since we're talking about the timeline, let's say this does happen in the 20th Congress, with SP Escudero saying it might be taken up after the SONA in July already, meaning there are already a new set of senators, new Congress members. What's the validity of that? I mean, help us understand, because you've also got some groups saying, some critics saying, it's not valid because they'd be having a fresh mandate. The senators will also, you have got new senators elected already, so it's not the same 12 that was in the 19th Congress.
So this was one of the questions that the panel was also split on, because I think they weren't sure about, or nobody's really sure about whether the Senate would still have the authority to continue. So there are two views currently. One view says that the Senate would get to continue because, as Senate President Rilon pointed out, or his view is that the Senate is an independent, the impeachment court transcends the Senate. And therefore it can continue even if the present Senate goes away and a new one is elected in the coming election. I think the other view, and that's really an accountability view, right? The idea that you should hold the Vice President accountable and therefore it should transcend the typical end of the term of the Senate. The other view is founded more on a democratic view of the Constitution, in the sense that, or the impeachment process, in the sense that when elections happen in May, that reflects a popular choice to elect different people. And that choice, or the choice of the people who will succeed the current Senate, should not be bound by the past Senate's decisions on whether to proceed to trial or not. So again, the jury is out. And if the question really is, so what's going to happen? It's the Senate again who gets to decide.
So I was going to say, who gets to pick? So it's still the Senate.
I think all the questions will only be answered by the Senate.
The Senate will throw out the hypothesis, and then it's the rest of the branches of government and political actors will contest that hypothesis. And ultimately, it's the Senate who gets a first crack at this.
Let's get to the third question.
No, before we move there, just one quickly, because this was interesting. I was talking to Attorney Tamasi earlier in the holding area, and I asked, okay, so if the 19th Senate moves and they decide on the rules for this impeachment, will the 20th Congress be bound by the rules of the 19th Congress? And his answer was
no. They can get to decide their own rules. The Senate is not bound by the rules of a previous Senate. Of course, that raises all sorts of questions about typically
about the case, like do you start over?
And does the impeached official, right? Is her due process rights violated by that sudden change in rules? So it opens up a lot of questions if it crosses over to June 30.
I told you it was interesting.
Third question in your forum. Is there a standard of evidence in impeachment trials? Should there be? And one thing that I found interesting with this one is apparently the bar is set lower. There doesn't have to be proof beyond reasonable doubt. Talk us through it.
Yeah, so for the information of all of the viewers, the quantum of evidence is this legal fiction threshold for a judge to decide whether to grant a relief or not, right? So if it meets that threshold, then a case is won or lost based on the judge. But you see how it's so confusing to hear. I'm just saying legal definitions. Imagine a person who is not trained as a judge getting to decide that. So the view of Professor Te, which I think the rest of the panel shared, was that these standards for judges, preponderance of evidence, proof beyond reasonable doubt, to a certain extent probable cause for prosecutors, they're addressed to people who are trained in law and who really deal with these types of questions on a day-to-day. But the impeachment will be decided by people who are not, most of them are not lawyers.
Yes, but the ones arguing will be lawyers. So it kind of confuses me as a non-lawyer, right? So we're saying it's political. We're not going to hold them to the highest quantum of evidence. But then again, there are lawyers arguing for the impeached official. They're lawyers picked for the prosecution panel. And then in the end, the decision could be, not based on law.
Yeah, definitely. So that's just one of the unique features of impeachment that, while a judge will typically look at law and fact, if you look at the Corona impeachment, if you look at the Estrada impeachment, a lot of the discourse is centered on just the conscience of the judges or the senators who get to decide that case. So you can't put a standard of proof on conscience. And therefore, a lot of it comes from the fact that these senators were elected by people, were trusted by people to make the right decision, even in cases of impeachment.
I think it was Attorney Te who said this, and I liked his answer so much I wrote it down during the forum. He said, in looking at the evidence, senators should answer the one question: what would convince me that this person should not hold office again, overriding the will of the people who put them there in the first place? Ultimately, and that's what you're saying about the conscience. It doesn't have to be like a criminal case, proof beyond reasonable doubt that they're guilty. It's just, what would convince me that this person should not hold office again?
Yes, and that's not a low bar. That's quite a high bar.
Oh, okay.
Because in order to say, impeachment ultimately overrides the fact that people, in the case of elected officials, that these people were elected by people directly. In the case of Vice President Duterte, 32 million votes or something. The Senate gets to decide that those 32 million votes, that their trust has been broken, and that despite the 32 million votes, she should not be trusted with office anymore. So if judges and senators take their job seriously, the conscience thing is actually harder, because it's easy to say that this didn't meet the quantum of evidence. It's very hard to say, honestly, that from a matter of conscience, this person should not be trusted with public office anymore.
Well, Professor, in the last two impeachment cases, you've got two presiding officers who were both lawyers. Chief Justice Davide and Senate President Juan Ponce Enrile. And now you look at Cheese Escudero, he's also a lawyer. Does that influence how he will preside over this impeachment trial?
It does, in the sense that you can trust that there will be a little more procedure and order than if it were a non-lawyer sitting as Senate President. So, but you can look at it really more of as like basic rules or heuristics, right? Who gets to say first, who gets to decide these objections. The Estrada and the Corona trials were aided by very competent lawyers. So Senate President Enrile and Chief Justice Davide. Senate President Escudero is also along those lines. He used to be a faculty member of the College of Law as well, so he would probably know the procedure.
So more procedural.
Yeah, it definitely will not be, the determinative factor in the impeachment. But in terms of just getting the proceedings orderly, then he would contribute to that.
Okay, we're running out of time, but we still do need to get to the last question, which is what Shawn was asking earlier. If a case is brought to raise these questions, may the Supreme Court step in?
I think there's no question that the Supreme Court would have the authority to step in. No, it would have jurisdiction for whatever grave abuse of discretion the House and the Senate would commit or had committed. But whether it should step in is a different question.
So it's a conscience thing for them too?
Well, not exactly like that, but more of to decide whether these questions should be decided by judges and not by politicians and the people themselves. So that's what we call justiciability, and really the familiar term is the political question. So the courts typically don't decide those questions. They leave it to the political branches to decide. And I think the panel in the impeachment forum was quite split. Of course, Justice Carpio Morales, who wrote a famous decision on this, did say that the court had the discretion to step in. Senate President Duran was more of to the point that the court should stay clear and let the Senate play its role in this impeachment.
I'm going to reiterate a question that Senator Dulon raised during the forum. He did ask, what happens if the Senate does not follow the Supreme Court? Will there be will they be declared in contempt? What are the consequences?
And can they not follow the Supreme Court?
That's exactly what the political question is. So the court tries to avoid that type of determination because it will be forced to reckon with its own legitimacy. What if the Senate doesn't follow the Supreme Court? And that creates a constitutional crisis of sorts. So if the court doesn't feel that it has the moral authority, to put it in those words, to decide this question, then it will probably just step back and let the Senate decide itself.
There were no such issues during the last two impeachment trials that we saw with President Erap and with CJ Corona. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there was no hotly debated Supreme Court, try the last-minute save going on there.
There was one in the Corona impeachment, at least as to the secrecy of the bank accounts.
The U.S. dollar accounts.
Yeah, the dollar accounts. So that was raised in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually issued the TRO. People forget it now. And the Senate decided to respect it, but not without having a procedural vote on it. So that shows that while the court does get to weigh in quite authoritatively on this question, the Senate is not just going to follow the Supreme Court blindly. It's going to look at the decision of the court and decide on its own whether it will respect it or not.
So kumbaga noted.
Yeah. With that case, no
sorry, we're fast running out of time, but I just have to squeeze in this one question. All along, we've been talking about the impeachment process, but can I take you a step back and look at the process of the initiation of the impeachment complaint? Because that's another issue, and we've heard both sides of it. The last person we spoke to about it was some of the House prosecution panel members, and then they reacted to what Attorney Israelito Torion said. Attorney Torion is part of a group of Mindanaoan lawyers who are asking the Supreme Court to declare null and void the impeachment, saying that it was defective on technical grounds. It did not go through the correct verification process, and it violated the one-year prohibition rule. What are your thoughts on that? Just very quickly, about a minute.
Yeah, I kind of disagree with Attorney Torion's point on this. So, Dean Torion's point, I think his case was that there were mandatory periods in the Constitution that the Senate, or that the House rather, did not follow. And therefore, that means that all of those prior impeachment complaints should be considered as filed, if I understand the case correctly. But those periods don't really affect the validity of a complaint or the invalidity of a complaint. And ultimately, it seems that the process followed by the House now is the same process that they followed during the Corona impeachment, which was really upheld. And therefore, it might be a difficult thing to argue in court.
Okay, fair enough. We're going to have to leave that there. Thank you so much for your time and insights and, all the information. Attorney Paulo Tamase, Senior Lecturer at the UP College of Law, specializing in constitutional law.
All right, it's time to pause for another quick break, but we do have more stories for you right after that. Keep it here on One News. back. Thanks for staying with us here on The Big Story.
Now here's an update on the health condition of Pope Francis. The Vatican reported that the Pope had a stable night and is sleeping and resting well. While the pontiff remains in critical condition, there have been no new respiratory crises. According to the Holy See Press Office, blood tests indicate mild renal insufficiency, but this is under control. Pope Francis is still on oxygen therapy, but is alert and well-oriented. Pope Francis was admitted on February 14 and later diagnosed with double pneumonia. With his hospitalization, many are left wondering what this means for the future of the Catholic Church.
And from real-life conclave to a fictitious depiction of the gathering of cardinals electing a pope, tonight's big picture is Conclave winning Outstanding Cast at the Screen Actors Guild Awards. On stage, John Lithgow, Ralph Fiennes, Sergio Castellito, and Isabella Rossellini acknowledged Pope Francis amid his hospitalization, saying their thoughts are with the pontiff. On a lighter note, this win could just mean an Academy Award trophy for Conclave. SAG's choices for winners usually align with those of the Oscars, which is happening on March 3. Among other big winners at the SAG are, for acting, Timothée Chalamet for A Complete Unknown and Demi Moore for The Substance.
Oh, that's pretty poetic. Conclave winning Best Cast.
I just also watched it. So right after the UP Law, the following night, Saturday night, we decided to watch Conclave.
Parang life imitating art.
How ironic. I'm running out of adjectives here. So let's just end it, shall we? That's it for The Big Story tonight.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.